Looks maxing is mouse maxing. And by mouse maxing, yes, of course, I'm referring to Calhoun's Mouse Utopia, Universe 25. Videos about the Mouse Utopia have been done to death on YouTube, so I'm not going to even review what it is. If you don't know what it is, just look it up. So, what do I mean by this? Well, looks maxing is not exactly a sign of a prosperous, healthy, vibrant culture that has much of a future ahead of it. Now, how could that be? It's just a more obsessive approach to looks, right? Well, no, I would say it is much more than that, much worse than that. Now, superficially, sure, it's a symptom of our hypervisual society where looks and visuals and optics have a disproportionate importance to virtually everything. And I'm not denying that this is the case. We are most certainly way past that at this point. But I do not see it as only a symptom of where we are, but it is something far more sinister. And here's how I would sum it up. I see looks maxing as a form of death worship. Yes, you heard that correctly, death worship. Now, how could that be? Looks are and always have been important to the mating process, of course. But during healthy cycles of history, and yes, this is a cycle, looks are not the most important thing when it comes to things like marriage and procreation, family formation, all of these necessary things. When a society is in an ascendant part of its cycle, then looks have a certain amount of importance. A person who was healthy would probably not want to marry someone who was disfigured or obese, although in certain times of history that could be seen as a sign of wealth, even though it wasn't physically attractive, which of course is not the case anymore. But a person would probably want to marry someone who was healthy and did not look like necessarily what we consider to be attractive today, but was just baseline healthy and attractive. So for a female, she wouldn't have to necessarily put on a lot of war paint and, you know, especially feminine clothes. She could just be a normal woman and that would be okay. Likewise, for a male, he could just be a normal, average looking, hardworking, good citizen type, and he would be able to pair off with someone who is about at his same station in society. Or to put it into modern language, people throughout much of history would pair off with their looks match, more or less. And then those couples would, of course, go on to get married. They would have children who would grow up, they would be raised, and society would perpetuate itself. Now, of course, the age we're living in now, we are seeing sharply declining birth rates, and I mean sharply declining, with so much of the world now being under a total fertility rate of 2.1, which is replacement rate. And also, especially in Western countries, marriage rates are way down and rates of singlehood are way up. So, looks maxing is not causing any of this, just to be clear. It is, on one level, a superficial level, a symptom of where society is. But it is also a big component in what I call death worship. And I'm being a slightly hyperbolic, but basically, I would define death worship as when a culture has just thrown in the towel on having a future that's better than what its present is. For most people, at least, for sort of the common people, so to speak, which it seems many have given up on, especially in Western countries. Now, if you are familiar with Calhoun's Universe 25, the Mouse Utopia, you know that over a span of a few years, at the end of the experiment, the mouse colony all died. All of them died. And remember that they didn't have predators in their environment. They had plenty of space. They had space that was not filled up, in fact. I don't know if that's a misconception or not, but there was physical space to expand into. They had unlimited water and food. Now, that's something that's perhaps in some ways a little bit different than our world because the human world is largely discovered and settled and developed. Now, of course, not every square inch. Actually, if you looked at what is developed on Earth, not much of it is actually physically occupied by humans. However, it's all owned or claimed by somebody, and the habitable parts are mostly done. They are settlements, villages, towns, cities, and so on. So, could more cities and towns be established in places where there's just territory right now, where there's just land and forests and deserts and such? I'm sure there could be, but for all intents and purposes, the earth is pretty much all over inhabited. It's just too busy, too crowded, and there is meaningfully no new territory to explore or expand into. So, just as the mice did, we have largely turned inwards, or we're turning inwards. And I will not say that that's a new thing. It isn't. It actually is a historical part of historical cycles too. And for us, the most recent beginning of this turning inwards towards excessive introspection, I don't know, that's almost too soft of a word for this, but self-absorption, there would be a better term, actually started in the West with about the early to mid 60s. And I've heard this referred to as the consciousness revolution. And of course, we all know some of the consciousness altering activities that were partaken of in the 1960s. But that's because there was an emphasis on inner space. And even back then, a lot of young people were feeling like the outer world was just too developed. It was too safe. It was too sterile in some ways, which I know sounds funny to, say a millennial or Gen Z audience who may not be aware of just how much history does repeat. Because we look back at this now and we think, oh, it was so lovely and vibrant and exciting and interesting back then. But that's not necessarily how people felt, and especially not young people, who, of course, differed from their GI generation parents who fought in the war and were quite overjoyed to have a society that was very stable, very safe, and very prosperous. It was much better than the tumultuous childhood and young adulthood that they grew up with the Great Depression and World War II. Of course, once society becomes overdeveloped and more urban and so on, one of the results is that birth rates go down. People become more self-absorbed, more self-focused, and that makes things like relationships, marriages, family life, community and civic life much harder to engage in, because the old model of those things are really extensions of yourself don't feel valid anymore, tragically. And so every moment spent with, say, civic participation feels like you're taking away from yourself, which I would say is an insane and, like I said, tragic way of looking at life. But that's where we are. We are not so much starting this new paradigm, but we are culminating with a paradigm that started about a generation after World War II, give or take. So now we've got figures such as this clavicular, who is the, what would you call him, patron saint of looks maxing, say. And ostensibly, the whole point of being more physically attractive is to attract a higher quality mate, or to attract more mates, and therefore spread your genes. That would be the present narrative that nobody can really escape, right? So the whole point is about maximizing reproductive fitness, if you're looking at it in a materialistic or scientific point of view. Now, what I find interesting is that is not actually the point of looks maxing, as far as I can tell. And I don't follow clavicular or the looks maxing quote unquote community and whatnot. I do see clips from time to time. It's pretty hard to avoid if you're on the internet at all, of course. But one thing that struck me as very nihilistic is I saw a clip of clavicular being interviewed by someone, and it just struck me as very nihilistic because the interviewer asked clavicular, Aren't you afraid that you'll get a woman pregnant? And Clavicular just very nonchalantly dismissed it and said, oh, I'm sterile from all the steroids. And that was it. He just really didn't seem to have any more thoughts other than that. And so, he was concerned with getting mates, but not procreating, which of course ostensibly is the entire point of trying to look max, so that you are more appealing to higher quality or higher quantities of potential mates. And so this really encapsulates well what I call the death culture or death worship. You're taking things that had a very necessary and important purpose in society, and you're just twisting them beyond recognition, and you're just doing them for the sake of doing them, or you're doing them in order to pursue dead ends. So, for example, pursuing sex without pursuing family formation, or reducing all of the pursuits of life to monetization, but you have no idea why you're trying to just make a number go up in bank account, or trying to optimize as many elements of life as possible without it actually leading to a future. And so from the outside looking in, it looks like death worship, as I call it. It is doing all of these things that used to have a meaning and a purpose, and it extended far beyond yourself and extended into the future of not only you, but your family, your community, which those used to be real things, your nation, and perhaps even the world, if the achievement or the influence was great enough or important enough. And so from the outside looking in, it just looks like the goal of this culture now is to be the richest, best looking, but childless, familyless, communityless corpse in the graveyard. That seems to be the whole purpose of everything. That seems to be where everything is headed. So if you are a younger person and you are just sick of where things are and the future that you've been deprived of, your feelings are completely valid, because really so much has been lost, and just worse than just lost, been thrown away. And all any of us are getting for our trouble is just a massive dose of nihilism that cannot possibly lead to anything good. The point of the mouse utopia was not just that, if a traditional, normal way of life for the species is not available anymore, people will become obsessed with their appearance. Well, it's much deeper than that, yes, but it is looking into yourself for meaning and purpose, because you cannot find it on the outside. That is really the whole point of it. It could be grooming, like the mice did, or looks maxing like the human versions do. But for any social creature, any social species, the general result could only be the same under similar conditions. That is really the only possibility. As an old poem went, no man is an island. That is to say that human beings cannot really be what they are truly meant to be if they treat themselves as islands, and if the culture treats them as islands. Because in this endless sea of nihilism, the only possibility is that all of those islands end up deserted.